I'm fascinated to hear the topic of your talk today on whether we have too much complexity within the economy. This is something I also see in my own research related to the global food system, that perhaps the complexity is so great that it's hard to really manage it effectively. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jeroen and he can take us away, and we'll have time then after the talk for some questions. Thanks, Jeroen.
Great, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me well and see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm taking a risk a little bit because this topic, the title, does a sustainability transition require regulation of economic complexity, which you might call decomplexify, is not something I talk about normally. So this is a new lecture, and then that's always interesting, both for the audience and the speaker. So, well, as a starting point, I would like to say that in my view, and I think many people share that, it is clear that the impact of the environmental policies that are in place worldwide is rather disappointing, especially if you look at climate change. So, for instance, in this graph, you see the change in annual emissions since several decades, and we don't see a clear trend of decline, what we need. So, yeah, what is happening? Of course, a very obvious first response would be policies are not very effective. They could be more effective. They could be more stringent. But there are a lot of policies in place from local to national scale. So in addition, it seems that systemic indirect effects frustrate effectiveness. Maybe you know the terminology, rebound, leakage, green paradox, less known, which means that oil markets respond. So for instance, if renewable energy becomes a threat to oil, then oil markets will drop prices. And in fact, after the Paris Agreement, shortly after the Paris Agreement was signed, oil prices were quite low. And that might have been a response to the threat that there was a transition coming up. And of course, oil markets want to postpone that. Now, another explanation, which is not completely independent from these factors, is the potential role of complexity increases that are triggered by searching for solutions to environmental and climate problems. And I will talk about this specific topic here. So a concrete starting point is work by Joseph Tainter, who in my view has written the first clear account of this. So he's a historian and anthropologist. He looked at historical societies, and he found that many responses to environmental and resource problems tend to increase cultural, what he calls cultural complexity, comprising the economy, politics, technology, information. And in turn, the economy requires more energy material inputs, which creates kind of a dilemma of insolvability of these problems, or even worsening of them. This goes somewhat against the common view of history as increasing economic complexity, which goes hand in hand with progress and problem solving. So Tainter, all in all, suggests that future sustainability and hence social stability and progress are compromised by increasing complexity. Inspired by his ideas, I have here some potential links between complexity, sustainability, in short phrases. They're not facts, they're more like hypotheses that need more research. So sustainability requires hard problem solving, not a passive consequence. It's not a passive consequence of consuming less. This is interesting in the current debate about climate and growth, because there is this strong perspective now in academia, at least, of degrowth, which means we have to consume less. Is that really going to be a solution? That's interesting also to look at from the perspective of complexity. So Tainter suggests that complexity can reach diminishing returns and become ultimately ineffective. I think that's an interesting thesis, because we see that anything that can solve problems or that can increase productivity is subject to diminishing returns. Tainter also stresses that the complexity in problem solving does it damage subtly, in a subtle way, unpredictably and cumulatively over the long term. So it's not something that suddenly appears. And that's also why it's difficult to test and to prove. Sustainability may require even greater consumption of resources, or circularity, I will talk about that as well, rather than less. And from this he derives the idea that one must be able to afford sustainability. This again has a reflection in the growth debate, because there is this school of thought which says that we can only solve environmental problems if we become rich enough, for monetary reasons, but maybe also for behavioral reasons, because then we become sufficiently interested in solving certain problems. Now, the ultimate conclusion of Tainter is that a society can be destroyed by the cost of environmental problem solving. And he offers empirical evidence for that. In his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, published by Cambridge University, he examines various societies, smaller and bigger ones, the Maya and the Roman Empire, very different ones in different areas of the world. He uses various conceptual methods, network theory, energy economics, and complexity theory. And his thesis is that societies collapse when investments in social complexity reach diminishing marginal returns. So he uses this graph as shown, where the returns can increase over time and then they can drop at some point. So the question is, where is our society now? What's the evidence for the modern economy? Well, I've listed here randomly some elements that might suggest that the thesis is correct. So if you look at carbon capture and batteries, these are what is sometimes called add-on technologies, like the older idea of end-of-pipe technologies in abatement of emissions. And these make existing technologies that we use to create economic goods and services and to achieve economic productivity. They make these existing technologies and their underlying production systems more complex. But they don't contribute to productivity. In fact, they may reduce productivity because you will use more energy and capital and human labor to produce the same economic output, but with less environmental pressure. In addition, we see that there's a lot of new technologies, for instance, in renewable energy, that substitute to some extent existing fossil fuel-based technologies. They have complex innovation histories and complex production systems. That means they also contribute to environmental pressure, but they usually don't immediately replace the old technologies, but rather add to the diversity of technologies in place. This holds for energy generation, but generally for production and consumption technologies. Interestingly, I didn't mention it here, but there is a study which looked at 50 years of renewable energy, and it found that renewable energy only replaced 10 to 25% of fossil fuel technology, and the rest went into satisfying new energy demand. So it's not just a matter of replacement, it's adding more technology, more diversity. Well, a completely different example is that we undertake massive public R&D in universities and research institutes on climate solutions, but without a concrete solution so far. You in the room and I am here in Spain, we are all part of that. And I see more and more research on climate. You cannot keep up with it. There's more journals every month, it seems. So that's a big effort. It takes a lot of energy, labor, capital. One concern that I have about solving climate change and environmental issues in general is that there are indirect effects. So if you talk about climate change, indirect greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions. And these innovations and also current policies do not guarantee that these indirect emissions are being taken care of, are being controlled well. So this relates, for instance, to purchase versus use decisions. We have technologies, we have standards that maybe improve purchase decisions. People opt for cleaner technologies. But then in the use phase, they may rebound because these cleaner technologies also are often cheaper in the use. We also don't take account of the complex production chains and life cycles. You need specific policies. I will say also more about that later. So as a result, we don't opt for the lowest carbon solutions over the whole life cycle and production chain. So for instance, if you buy solar PV, you are often driven by the cheapest available technologies in the market, which often come from China. But as we know, a lot of electricity in China used also in production systems is based on on coal with a high carbon intensity. So you're probably not making the best choice if you opt for the lowest price. And in fact, I did a comparison for these technologies between the three important suppliers, USA, Germany, and China, and the differences are quite significant. And I assume, and there must be studies for that, that this holds similarly true for electric vehicles. And people will be triggered not by CO2 emissions over the life cycle, but by prices when they buy these products. Another example is, of course, biofuel investments. We know the history of that, and it's clear that because of subsidies, monetary subsidies, people made choices that were not good really in energy terms. So some technologies hardly generated net energy, and still they seem popular because of subsidies. And this has been shown to hold true for various versions of corn ethanol, biodiesel, and even algae biofuels. Of course, there's increasing communication about climate change in public and social media, also distant face-to-face online meetings, but also physical meetings. The UN COP meetings with tens of thousands of participants are famous, but it's not the only example. And all this uses a lot of energy, carbon, and human labor. And also online meetings are not for free. And also we send a lot of big files around. All of that adds to our carbon footprint. So altogether, these examples show that we are creating more variety and more connections, and increasing variety and connectivity are exactly what is complexity, I think. And the global economy, which is getting more connected and more tight, and smaller it seems, means additional complexity. And global energy markets, regions that destabilize the global system. The heterogeneity is enormous at the global level. In terms of climate, it's important that we have high versus low income countries, fossil fuel exporters versus importers, which makes the whole system complex, also to find effective solutions. And then we have international trade and relocation, which cause carbon leakage and international rebound. This scheme shows that, in fact, the lack of a good climate agreement contributes to these problems, both international rebound and national rebound. Carbon leakage is basically a specific case of rebound. People don't realize that often, but I think rebound covers everything. The Paris Agreement did not achieve actually harmonization of national policies, which is necessary both to limit leakage, but also to allow strong policies at the national level that can control rebound. And the Paris Agreement ultimately is not an agreement. It's more like a collection of voluntary offers, promises, the pledges by the different countries. There's, of course, a literature on energy complexity, EROI, maybe you know that. EROI stands for Energy Return on Energy Investment, which is kind of a measure of net energy or energy surplus. It's a physical cost measure, not a monetary cost measure. So you look at how much energy do you need to invest to get energy back. And of course, fossil fuels were very attractive originally because they had a high concentration. I mean, in the beginning, for oil, you needed to just bore a well and the oil under high pressure came out. You didn't have to do much effort to get the oil out of the ground. Now that's not so easy because we have exhausted easy resources. So the EROI of oil and of coal has gone down, of oil more. And we don't exactly know what it is on average worldwide. Some people say it's around 20, it's around 30. There's a lot of debate on that. But what is interesting, if you look at the renewable future, then it looks like it will have a lower EROI, and that's not attractive. But it's a consequence of a complex production system behind renewables that uses up itself a lot of energy and labor and capital. It's a complex production system, and it in fact reduces the productivity of the overall economy. And so the complexity again works against progress of the economy in a way. In fact, you could say that the transition to renewable energy is economically not logical. It's only driven by environmental goals. Because if you look at the history of energy transitions, we usually went to more concentrated forms of energy. And now, for the first time, we're moving to less concentrated forms of energy. And that creates less productivity for the economy as a whole, and that's a challenge. Because in fact, and that's dangerous thesis also, and that's, he's not the only one who has said that, the surplus energy in the past was the basis for a complex society. And that started with the first agricultural revolution, and the industrial revolution speeded that up a lot. And we're still in the beginning of the industrial revolution. That was only 200 years ago. If you look at evolutionary history of life and complex systems, that also suggests that more energy availability or higher EROI translates in more complexity. So the question is, what does it mean for the future? Can we not maintain the complexity we have now? Do we have to go to a simpler economy, as the degrowth movement suggests? Again, interesting questions that I don't have a simple answer to. What is also important to discuss, I think, if we talk about all these topics, is the idea of circularity, the circular economy, a tremendously popular topic and concept and name if you look on internet and journals. I personally avoid talking about circular economy. I prefer to use the term semi-circular economy, because I don't think circular economy on any relevant time scale is possible. In fact, perfect circularity doesn't exist in nature either, unless you take a very long time scale. But at short time scales, there's no 100% recycling of nutrients either. So it's all a matter of time scales. And solving climate challenges is also a matter of time scales. So if we don't solve our problems in several decades, we're really in for bad times. And so this is the challenge of circular economy. Now, the circular economy is going to make our economy more complex. There's no doubt about it. And because we will add more cycles and feedback loops in the economy. We could leave this extra complexity out by relying in the past on virgin resources and waste processing, but we have to rely more on recycling and reuse. And we don't know how to do that in an environmentally responsible way. So this is a huge experiment, and there's not much positive to say about the circular economy so far. Most people, most experts are quite cynical about it, I have the feeling. And I worked a little bit on it. I wrote one paper on it, and that made me also quite negative. So for instance, there's now increasing literature on materials rebound, that you have recycling, but in the end you use more materials of different types. Or you will shift, maybe you can reduce materials use or increase materials recycling, but then you will rely on more energy use. So there is a problem shifting going on there. Now, what's also important to get a good solution that doesn't increase complexity in environmental problems with regard to circularity is that you have systemic policies that cover all the indirect effects. And there are no such policies in place. What I see is still a lot of pleas for partial policies. This is kind of a second best approach. And it assumes that we know very well what are clean and dirty options, that we have to move society and individual choices to clean alternatives. But there are no perfectly clean alternatives. Everything is dirty to some degree. Electric vehicles, well, in our world, right now, they maybe have 70%, 50% of emissions, not 10%, not 0% of emissions. They're not clean technologies. We use these terms. They're not accurate terms. So if we have technological standards, for instance, that steer people towards these technologies, that's not going to solve the problems, apart even from what will happen when people have these technologies, which may rebound in the use phase. So the semi-circular economy will increase complexity. We have to deal with that. And I personally think with regard to emissions, CO2 emissions, there's only one instrument that can cover systemically the emissions and make sure that we really reduce emissions net totally overall. That's carbon pricing. I have here a graph which shows that carbon pricing, if you do it well, I hope it's readable, if you do it upstream in the green boxes to the left, then it will permeate through the whole system from energy resources to intermediate production to final production to transport to final deliveries. Because carbon pricing will go through the system and will add in each phase carbon costs to the price. And ultimately, the prices will reflect the emissions over the whole life cycle. Nobody knows exactly how many emissions there will be because of the complexity of production. Take a car. A car is so complex. A car goes through hundreds of industries. Nobody can calculate CO2 emissions. I know my colleagues in life cycle analysis try it, but I don't trust these numbers, and they have a lot of debate. And the first thing they will say, it's very uncertain, our estimates. Carbon pricing doesn't lie. There's no way that carbon pricing will lie, but because firms will not survive if they don't do their job of financial accounting well. So I think it's the best way forward with regard to CO2 emissions, not to all environmental problems. And then finally, the final price will reflect all the emissions. This holds for intermediate services and goods, for final services and goods. So in my view, carbon pricing is the ideal instrument to deal with dynamic system complexity as far as CO2 emissions matter. Now, I was asked to talk, I think, also a little bit about transitions research. So I will shift the discussion a little bit to that. So transitions research is this new area. I was editor of the journal, so I know it quite well, although I'm, as a researcher, maybe not in the center of it. If there is a center, there's a lot going on. And I will clarify that a little bit. What is interesting is that the four main approaches to transitions research, which are listed here: innovation systems research, multi-level perspective. Frank Geels is an important person there. Complex systems theories. Jan Rotmans, who was an early person in the field, and now Derek Loorbach, they use those concepts a lot. And evolutionary systems, and I wrote with my PhD student, well, she's now an associate professor, Karolina Safarzinska, a lot on that. So these four approaches, they all deal to some extent with complexity, so that's interesting. But I must also say, they don't deal really with the issues I've discussed so far. Because at the end of the day, I see that a lot of transitions research is very partial. There's, well, maybe I should go to the next slide, which tries to overview the field. So what I did with one of my colleagues, who is a star in doing linguistic analysis, and we took all the articles from the first 10 years, and we looked at if they, well, which topics they dealt with. And here you can see it, eight main topics. And you don't see that complexity is very explicit there. It's maybe hidden behind it, but you also see that there's many partial, not systemic topics like urban studies. It's a very big area. But of course, if you want to deal with climate change, city is not a systemic perspective. City is a very partial perspective. So I could talk more about it. I'm not going to do that. If you're interested, you can see the slides maybe later. What is interesting also is that we invited people in the field to come up with ideas for the future. There was a special issue published in 2021 in the journal about the next decade of transitions research. And here you see a little bit more complexity topics. So I identified three main issues here. First of all, several people suggested we need more attention for multi-system research. So how different systems, energy, water systems, agricultural systems, how they are connected and how problems can shift between those. So, well, this deals with various suggestions, transition speed, positive, negative feedback between subsystems, how systems can change because there are different roles for different actors in the systems. Names like entanglers, first movers, landscape makers are being used here. A second set of suggestions comes from complexity research, talks a lot about failed transitions, economic crisis, backlashes, phase out. It's a lot of jargon that can be interpreted in different ways. Other terms there are reconfiguration of regimes. And so you find here, on the one hand, planning perspectives that try to go through systematically through different phases of transitions, look at the different levels of transitions. There's also more evolutionary angles that understand that systems are not very predictable. And a third topic that I found very interesting is the topic of so-called mega projects, very big projects that some people think are a risk to sustainability and others think that are essential to solve our problems. So the question here is, do we need to experiment with it? Do we need to learn from that? We know that big projects always overshoot their time deadlines, they overshoot their cost assessments. We know there's a lot of lobbying because there's a lot of interest, and we know there's a lot of project complexity. So this is an interesting area of research, I think. So I'm towards the end of my lecture, but I still have a lot to say. So I'm improvising here a little bit because it's a new topic for me also. So I think we have to decomplexify the system. We have to try to not make economic systems and solutions to environmental problems along the transition paths too complex, but we don't have explicit policies in place, I think. We have to assume that complexity is likely to increase along a transition path, which then results in more energy and material use and environmental pressure. So I also feel that planning or regulating complexity is not a good idea because it assumes that someone understands the complexity or even the changes in complexity that are coming about. And if you do that, you might also frustrate trajectories that are essential to find good solutions for the future. So I think planning and regulating is risky. The other idea that small is beautiful, that we have to do everything local, that is quite strong, that idea, both in the degrowth societies and also in transition studies. But I also am skeptical about that, because I think our biggest challenge are the grand problems of climate change, biodiversity loss, and they are very internationally connected. So we don't find solutions at the local level for that. I think what we risk then is that we will shift problems in space, in time, or to other problem categories. So I think it's essential that we have coordination and also scale economies, especially for a world with so many people. And I personally think that degrowth, with all its good intentions, is likely to result in a lot of negative systemic effects, especially also in a lot of rebound. If you get so far in convincing people to consume less, but you don't do it with systemic policies, then I think people will just shift to other problems, especially if salaries will remain the same. People will like to spend their salaries. So another issue here to discuss is whether we need decentralized or centralized energy solutions. Because of course, in climate solutions, moving to low carbon energy, to renewable energy is extremely important. But how to do that? Putting solar PV on every roof, or having big industries that produce renewable energy? We don't talk so much about that. I don't think there's a good literature on that. I think we need it. I think we need to think more about that. Also in terms of complexity, you might say that everything decentralized is complexity, or maybe not. It depends how you define complexity. So it's difficult to even judge if a decentralized or centralized solution is more or less complex. Of course, with a centralized solution, you have in any case more scale economies, which is an advantage, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of learning and probably innovation. And then there's the transport issue. If you have decentralized solutions, will there be more transport? Might also be an issue to consider, I think. Transport is always an important contributor to complexity. Given these remarks which I made, I think also taking into account that complexity has a cost, that it's good to give incentives that make sure that people trade off costs and benefits of complexity. Because people well, there's many decisions that people make in innovation, in adoption, in daily use that have to do with complexity. And the planner, the central government cannot deal with these adequately, because cannot oversee all the consequences, all the costs and the benefits. And I think local decisions are in that sense, it's not the same as decentralizing, but local decisions can make these trade-offs better. But they need to be incentivized. There needs to be some information coming to them to say what are the indirect effect of all the decisions made. For CO2 emissions, again, I think carbon pricing can translate that complexity. But for other environmental problems, it's more difficult. So you need information about that. There is an emerging literature on environmental problem shifting. Very different terminologies are being used there, trade-offs, co-benefits, co-costs, and so on. Also, there's a small literature on circular economy and complexity and how to deal with it and how to make decisions. So there's no simple solution. There is ideas in the literature in any case. And then finally, again, coming back to this issue of complex technologies and also mega projects, these tend to have long innovation paths and complex production and support systems. Again, betting heavily, for instance, on carbon capture and removal, is that a wise strategy? I'm not very convinced about that, because I think we still need decades of research on that. These are not mature technologies yet. So I personally would bet my money rather on maybe nuclear energy. I'm not a big fan of that, but I think as a strategy next to extreme climate change, I don't think it's bad. And you see that also the discussion in the public and political system is changing towards that. And we have more experience with nuclear fusion than with some other technologies that are being discussed. Nuclear fission is another technology. There is a big complex technology being experimented with, the ITER or ITER project at Cadarache in France. It's probably the most complex project on this planet that we are undertaking. And it's a project that's famous for overshooting its budget and time deadlines. And some of the experts on nuclear fusion always say we still need 80 years. And we always say that. We said that 80 years ago, we still are saying it. I don't know if that's true. In the ideal scenario, nuclear fission is a fantastic technology, but I don't know. The complexity is enormous. So it would be interesting to also study this from a complexity perspective more, I think. So in general, I think what I offered you is no clear results and insights. It's rather a hypothesis. And I think it's important to study this from a genuine systemic perspective, because only then we know what to expect as a final solution. So that means accounting for uncertainty, for indirect effects, for unintended effects of also well-intended strategies and policies, and especially giving attention to rebound and problem shifting. So here I'm at the end of my lecture. I have some resources here in the literature if you're interested. Thank you for your attention.
We have a question still online, so shall we go for online first? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Yes, Anna.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeroen. That was a brilliant overview of the complexity we need to navigate in order to make our societies more sustainable. Also, some very provocative ideas, which I hope we can have a discussion about now. So I already see we have a question online from Anna van Bergh. So Anna, do you want to say your question?
I don't hear anything.
No, that's true. I just needed a moment. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
I was late trying to get to the venue. Hi, thank you very much for interesting presentation. I think there's many interesting ideas there. And also this fact that there's no clear policy on circular economy, I think was confirmed by the analysis of PBL, who's also here in this meeting I saw. But one was more smaller question that I noticed. You said I don't have faith in like life cycle assessment, for example, of cars. So that's quite a big statement. And I thought, but if we want to price it, we'll actually need that information. But more interesting, I thought, is this question of how do these fields of transition science and complexity science, which clearly they have some kind of relationship. And in the Netherlands, transition science is so strong, especially in the way that policy actually looks at big decisions like circular economy, that I really wonder what is the relationship between them. And I think it's maybe even a question for everybody, but maybe you can give us some thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, your first point I understand is life cycle analysis needed for pricing. Well, I think for carbon pricing it's not needed, because carbon pricing just puts a price on each molecule of CO2, or no, that's not accurate, on each atom of C that then may be burned to CO2. So that will then in each phase of the complex production cycle be calculated in the cost accounting of firms and automatically be added into the price. So I don't think we need life cycle analysis. No, I don't see that at all. But for if you don't have such a clear relationship, for instance, between an environmental problem or an emission or a waste and an input, then pricing becomes more difficult. So then maybe you need to do accounting. What is this particular process now contributing to environmental pressure? And if we want to price it or put a cost on it, okay, then we have to know at that point, yeah, what are the magnitudes. So for other environmental problems, I can see that, but for carbon, I don't see it. No, and that's good news in a way, you know, because simpler, the better the solution, you know. And also, let me say, simple remark. So if we would have to do so much life cycle analysis for this complex problem, that's just adding to the complexity of the system, more energy use. All these life cycle analysis don't come for free. They also have a cost. And we don't see that. These are small costs, but if you do that for millions of products and technologies, and you have to do it again because there's a new technology, okay, the people who do it like it because it's a job for them. But yeah, it's just adding to the complexity of the whole system, of course. So if we can avoid that, the carbon price doesn't make the system so much more complex. That's also nice. Yeah.
Okay.
And no, sorry, I had another question about transitions research in the Netherlands and circularity. I'm not sure how to deal with it. I guess there is research from the transition perspective on circularity, but I don't know it very much. It's very difficult to overview circularity of research also because it's a huge field. If you look on Google, there's so much going on. Nobody can overview it. And that's also, I have to make a cynical comment there too. We are not close to circularity, but we're producing a lot of research on circularity. So there is kind of, I don't have the feeling there's a proportionality there, that we're moving quickly through all that research to a solution to circularity. I don't see it. And in fact, there's a lot of, almost every article makes cynical comments in that area.
Okay. Thank you very much. Anna?
Can you hear me like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have 2 points. One,
I don't hear you well, sorry. Can you leave?
I can also speak, but you can speak here.
So one
Yes,
point
better.
related to power. It's like, don't you think that power should be an element to be extremely considered when you're talking about complexity? Because I'm a bit skeptical that complexity itself is the source of unsustainability. And also when you consider extreme power concentration, which is a reality in many sectors in our economies, you actually have a decrease in complexity, but has a lot of negative consequences for our climate, for our politics, and so on. So there is one aspect there. And the other aspect is just about degrowth. Degrowth scholarship is not about just consuming less. It's about changing systemically our society so that our economy is no longer dependent on economic growth, and so that it's no longer just around increasing profits, but actually increasing well-being of everyone and reducing inequalities. So
Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, regarding the latter, that sounds so nice. The degrowth ideals. It's like, but personally, I think, and that I know people will not like it if I say that, but I think most people who embrace degrowth, it seems seem not to be the experts on climate policy, because with degrowth talk, you're not going to solve the problems. We're not going to change away from capitalism. Honestly, do you really believe that? And if there's a softer version of degrowth, then it's usually not very innovative. I personally don't see what degrowth offers in terms of innovations that are realistic also. We just need to get support for effective policies. It's not more complicated. than that, I think. But okay, that's another discussion. Regarding power, I was not 100% sure if you mean electric power or let's say social power. I guess social power. I don't know if power, of course, power is part of the complex construction of our economy and society. But I could also imagine that power is good to solve environmental problems. For instance, China is the country where the power is most centralized in the world, I think. That might work well ultimately for controlling and regulating the environmental impact of its economy. And China, for instance, now also has a carbon pricing system that is reasonably effective, not completely, because they also built into it that the system can grow because they foresee still 5% growth and they don't want to frustrate their growth. So they don't have a carbon pricing system, for instance, like the EU ETS, which is much more restrictive and will be more restrictive in coming years, which is also by far the most effective policy in the whole world now. I would, if you don't believe me, just contact me, because there's a lot of evidence for that now. And also theoretically, you can understand that the price of EU ETS permits now is around €100 per ton. And it's harmonized among 30 countries. That's unique, and there's no other example of that. And that you could also say there's a lot of power in that system. It's a very centralized system. And I think that's what we need for global solutions, because we have a free riding problem. If we don't
about, for example, fossil fuel industry power.
Power of a fossil fuel industry, okay.
Interest power, that was my point.
Yeah, I'm not so worried about it, because I don't think many people like to blame the fossil fuel industry, that they have a lot of power. I don't see that so much. Our society is just very much dependent on fossil fuels. It's not easy to move away quickly. In fact, to build a renewable infrastructure, we still need a lot of fossil fuels, because we cannot build that with renewable energy itself. So yeah, I'm not worried about the power of the fossil fuel industry so much. There is some power, but there's also power of other industries. Lobbyists from NGOs have more and more power. I think the power distribution in our Western society is quite well distributed. I don't think there is the essence of the problem, to be honest. But I'm sure you can debate that more. I'm sure.
Okay. We have a hand up online, Andrew Ringsmuth. We can't hear you, Andrew.
Hi, do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hi, yes.
Great, okay, yes, great. Thank you for your talk. I thought it was a great overview. So you spoke with some enthusiasm about carbon pricing, and you also spoke about transition science. Would you mind just commenting on perhaps the overlap between those? Because carbon pricing has been this popular policy for a long time, but we're not seeing it at anything like the level that we would need to in order for it to be effective. And if we can't get it off the ground, then what's the good of it? So can you maybe just talk about what you see as the barriers to really getting serious carbon pricing happening?
Well, I think these barriers are the same barriers to get effective policies of any kind. I mean, the standards that we have on technology are not very effective either. Nothing is effective. So that's important to realize, because you could criticize a policy or be critical of a policy, but you have to know what is a comparison with other policies. So I think carbon pricing is the only, I think we're not going to solve climate change without carbon pricing. I'm 100% sure of that, because then we will have huge rebounds. And I think also a lot of the solutions in the past have rebounded away because we didn't have systemic closure. So I think you need systemic closure, and I don't see how you can have systemic closure without any other instrument of carbon pricing. Because if you price carbon at the source, then anything later that will use that carbon, that will burn fossil fuels, will be punished by a price. And then ultimately, if something over the whole life cycle will use a lot of CO2, well, then it will get a big punishment at the end in its final price. Now, what's the evidence that carbon pricing can work? Well, the EU ETS, it has to be done supranational. Look, for instance, at what happened now with the high energy prices recently because of the Ukraine invasion by Russia. A lot of countries in Western Europe have eliminated or reduced a lot of energy taxes to meet the complaints that energy prices were too high. Which system has not been touched? The EU ETS. Nobody has even talked about it. Why is that? Because it's a supranational system. National governments cannot touch it. And so I think this is the only way to solve the climate problem to have a supranational agreement. But the Paris Agreement is not going to do it. So I think the only way forward is, and that's not my idea only, is to have a climate club of ambitious countries that increases over time and has a joint carbon price. I cannot see any other solution to climate change, honestly. And I'm willing, this is, by the way, a lecture I give a lot. So if you're interested, you can find my lecture on this with more details on YouTube, you know?
Well, thank you. I mean, this is...
Sorry, we have another question in the room. Yeah, I have one comment and one question. The first one is, I want to hear your opinion on how carbon pricing can solve the just transition issues, because recently a lot of discussion about whether carbon pricing will be another shock therapy. And the second comment is about, in my opinion, complexity also go hand in hand with the capability. So whether this is a coordination failure problem or it's just too much complexity, I want to hear your opinion.
Okay, thank you. That's a obvious question, the first one about justice. I would say, first of all, carbon pricing in developing countries with low incomes or medium incomes has been shown by many studies to be progressive, meaning because many rich people consume the large extent of energy based on fossil fuels, so they will get punished. The relatively rich in those countries will be punished. Even for the high income countries, carbon pricing can already be progressive. But of course, the proposal now by all the experts is to make it progressive explicitly by using the revenues of a carbon price to change income taxes. This is kind of this double dividend approach where you use carbon pricing or carbon taxes to reduce labor taxes, but not just randomly to reduce them, especially for low income households, because they will see their bills, energy bills rise. Of course, many people think then, many laypersons think, yeah, but then it doesn't work because first you're taking money, you're giving money. No, because you change the relative price of low and high carbon goods and services through the carbon pricing. So even though people will not change their power to buy products, their economic power to buy products, they will still make different choices because the prices will stimulate it. Okay, and your second question I didn't understand completely. Capability and complexity. You mean capability of Amartya Sen? The idea of Amartya Sen, or which capability do you mean?
It's like, because a lot of times people are saying that the challenge we are facing with the climate change is not really about we don't have the solutions, but it's how we coordinate the solutions. That requires a capability public.
Yeah.
I was wondering, because you said a lot of the coordination across international level increased complexity, but I was also thinking, because that also has a lot to do with capability issues. I want to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Look, what I'm worried about, for instance, under the Paris Agreement, is that if the rich countries are really going to reduce their emissions significantly, which I don't see yet, but if they manage to do it, what will happen is that these emissions will move to developing countries. Why? Because these developing countries don't have hard targets, and they will not say, we don't want to increase our trade, our export, or we don't want to have this planned from an international company within our borders, because it's not consistent with our promises, our pledges in the Paris Agreement. No country will ever say that. What will happen is that countries will just not meet their pledges. That's going to happen in the future. So countries are in a way not capable of meeting their pledges. Why? Because there's no harmonization of policies. Countries that are very ambitious risk just that their economy will be damaged and the emissions will go somewhere else. Well, that's two problems not solved, you know, or one problem created, other problem not solved. That's not very stimulating. If that's going to happen, then countries are also quickly going to stop to have very strong unilateral policies. So the only way to make countries capable to have good actions is to make sure they know what the other countries are going to do. If all the countries have the same carbon price, everybody knows that, yeah, you know what the other countries are going to do, that there's no risk there. So then you can also increase the carbon price. So for me, the first goal is to have a group of countries that have jointly a carbon price, and there are 30 of those countries in the EU already, and a few additional ones out close to the EU. And my proposal, and of several other people, there's a publication in Nature on that, is that the EU, China, and the US make this club. It's not going to be easy, but it's only 3 partners to negotiate. probably first the US and the EU. And then if China joins, everybody wants to be part of that club. Because if that club puts a carbon border tariff to protect its policy, and it has a carbon price, then everybody will be damaged outside that club. And the only logical solution, rational solution, is to become part of that club. And that club will grow very quickly, and then you get a domino effect. That's in my logic, is the only solution for climate change. I cannot see any other. And I defy anybody to come from degrowth with other solutions. And I have a lot of debate on degrowth because my institute is filled with degrowth proponents. So I know all their reasonings, and I'm not convinced. I don't think degrowth has any future. Like someone said, degrowth is big in the world of ideas. It's very small in the real world of politics, and it will remain like that. I fear it's like that.
Claudia?
Yes, one of the things you said, if I remember, or if I understood correctly, is that you don't have much trust in regulations or in detailed regulations. But then, I mean, sure, of course, the carbon price is a very big and important chunk of policy, but there's also not like that we can only have one policy at all. And second, I mean, so just as an example, so if my father worked in plastic foil industry, so making packages for pasta and so on. And he told me there's people who want to, make the plastic use more circular. But then plastic packages, they consist of 5 layers of different types of plastic with some of the small additives to decrease the permeability to oxygen or whatever. And it's very hard to recycle something which consists of 5 different materials. And even if they consist only of one material, if they are dyed black, then you cannot separate them because you need to shine a laser through it to decide which plastic it is. So, I mean, for these sort of things, which are, of course, a small part of the problem, I mean, I could imagine that for this one partial problem, it would help to make rules that, for example, packages can only consist of one material. And then if this means that the shelf lifetime of a package of pasta goes from 1 year to half a year, then the supermarkets have to adjust to that because most people eat their pasta within less than half a year.
Okay, the point is clear, yeah. Yes, I can understand your reasoning. Still, I think many people will say, well, very strict standards will do a lot of damage to a lot of production cycles. We cannot produce a lot of things. We also know that, that plastics are not being recycled for all kinds of reasons. I think if you put a price on the materials that go into the plastics, it will be more worthwhile to recycle them. I think also their pricing can do a lot. Pricing for recycling is going to make recycling more effective. But I'm not against standards. So I'm in favor of adding standards to pricing because they fulfill very different roles. So standards can help sometimes to move away from a bottleneck or a lock-in situation. They also steer purchase decisions and capital decisions. But if you talk about the use phase and the rebound, then I think the pricing is very important. And I would like to make another comment, is that still the regulator may, with all good intentions, have all kinds of standards, but it may do damage to innovation trajectories, to certain sectors, because they don't have all the information. So I have little trust in regulation by regulators. And the final comment here is that, as I already argued, in order to solve certain problems, we need harmonization of policies. And if you make policies very complex with many instruments, it will be very difficult to compare them because they will not be transparent. For instance, with the current complexity of policies, who knows which country has stronger environmental policies? France or Spain or Germany or the UK? Nobody knows. But if you have a carbon price, I can tell you immediately by looking at the height of the carbon price. And then it's also easy to harmonize it and to make it uniform. But if you have complex policies, it's not so easy. So I am not of the school that that more policies is better. I think simpler policies is better as a starting point.
Sure, yeah. I was just thank you, by the way, for the talk. I was somewhere during the talk you said complexity equals the variety and the connections, if I remember that correctly.
Yes.
And I was curious if you're familiar with the work of Sornet Didier, I think you pronounce his name. He's from Zurich, and he talks a lot about prices. And he actually separates the two, where he has on the x-axis he has variety, and on the other axis he has the connections. And he actually shows that there's quite a difference between those two. What I mean by that is that if you have low variety and you have high connection, you get your dragon kings, as he calls them, the big instances of prices. But if you have high variety, you can have a relatively high number of connections. And then you still are in this area of self-organized criticality. So I was just curious, because there's this diminishing return of complexity, of course, right? Because you can always make it too complex, indeed, he also says. But there is this difference, according to him, with respect to variety and connection. So I was just curious if you could speak to that.
I don't know the specific reference, or maybe I didn't understand the name, but yeah, I know also in the literature on evolution and complex systems, this discussion of critical number of connections, critical variety, those. But it's interesting. I like that. I can see that the graph where variety and connectivity have different magnitudes, that leads to very different systems, and more stable systems, less stable systems. What is interesting to add to that probably is then to see how much material and energy use derives from that, how much transport. So to analyze these systems more from a sustainability perspective, not just, let's say, stability. Because a lot of the literature on that, I'm looking for a name. There's a famous name about this from books from several decades ago, but it's not focused on sustainability. It's focused on stability of the systems more, and that's another goal, but very interesting. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So Jeroen, thank you once again for your very interesting path through complexity and transitions. So I think you gave everyone a lot of food for thought, and yeah, hopefully we get to see you in person if you're ever back in the Netherlands.
Yes, well, it was very nice. You're a nice group, I can tell. I'm jealous not to be closer, but it looks like an interesting group of people and discussions there. Yeah. So my compliments.